I'm very happy to be able to begin the discussion on this particular panel. Before I let the panelists speak, I want to abuse my authority as the chairman of this panel and suggest a number of points for us to keep in mind as this panelists speak. First of all, I would ask you to put yourselves 20, 30 years ago into the 1960s and the 1970s, which is primarily the period that we will be covering. And as such, to realize that this was the period at which Ukrainian studies as a discipline were being established and then formulated. First, the attempt to teach the courses, those of us who were already at the university. And I would suggest that the two major developments, both in the United States and in Ukraine during this period. On the one hand, the Ukrainians abroad were able to organize, document, and institutionalize as a field of inquiry the study of Ukraine. That had not existed previously. At the same time, the establishment of these studies had a direct impact in Ukraine, and the knowledge of that information penetrated through a variety of ways to Ukraine and helped Ukrainians articulate their political goals in such a fashion that Ukraine was capable to establish itself when the opportunity arose as an independent sovereign state. These two developments are actually tightly knit when we look at the various, not only publications, but at the activities of various people. And I sort of feel here, I've lost the capacity to read, but I have not lost the capacity to talk. So you are subject to this. I feel like I am sitting here not as Martha Bohachevsky, the student of Columbia, but as a piece of, as a source of the period for the 1960s, 1970s, even the 1980s and the 90s. And what I would like to suggest, which perhaps some of you will find shocking, is that you keep in mind not only the differences between the so-called West and Ukraine, but the similarities of the societies, not the states, not the organizations, but the societies of Ukrainian activists, Ukrainian participants. And to me, I was struck by three similarities. Both the so-called diaspora and Ukraine relied on literature and ethnicity to self-identify. Both societies, in different fashion, were closed societies, including our diaspora society, at the time when the Ukrainoznauchi studies were being institutionalized. There were people in the organized community that questioned the manner in which this was being done, and also questioned the feasibility or even the moral principles of establishing contacts with the home country. So the fact that both societies in Ukraine had not only the regime, but also their own little enclaves. We in the emigration in the diaspora had similar enclaves. And finally, please remember that the political climate in the 60s and in the 70s was completely different from the political climate today, and even from the cultural climate at this university. We have to remember the important role that civic engagement played, and especially the important role of satire and humor. And satire and humor, the penetration of the level of that satire and humor, from the primitive ones that you find in the original KGB publications to the sophisticated ones of Nezhuriste, marks an uncharted fashion of how Ukrainian society functioned. On that brilliant note, I will not introduce the panelists because you, audience, have the capacity to read, which I no longer have, not being able to see small print. And you have read the achievements of all three of my distinguished panelists. So without much ado, I shall begin with Professor Belazza, who needs no introduction and gets none.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Mark Andrichik and all the people working at the organization of this conference for inviting me. For me, it is a great honor to be here as a speaker. As I already mentioned, I am Italian. I'm not of Ukrainian origin, so it is an honor to be part of this group, as in the last few years, I have been studying the topic of the Ukrainian diaspora as well. Okay. Thank you also for this introduction. I will say something on humor, as you will see from the second slide. I must admit that agreeing on presenting the history of the press and book publishing of the Ukrainian diaspora in the West was completely reckless. Because the quantity and quality of publication is such that it could be the object of a lifetime study. And unfortunately, there is not much scholarly literature about it that could help me in this. So this is the motivation for this title, An Almost Uncharted Universe. What I am going to do today is to give some general information about the history of Ukrainian periodical publications in the diaspora, Then I will go on to briefly analyze the journal Suchasnost, which in my opinion was probably the most important one from the point of view of the cultural debate. And finally, I will mention the role played by the Smoloskip publisher and the significance of its publication. And thus, I think I will have more or less pretended to hold to the abstract that I sent in the preparatory phase of this conference. Perhaps the first newspaper published by the Ukrainian diaspora was America, which first came out in 1890 under the editorship of Reverend Ivan Volyansky. America was soon joined by Svoboda, which is perhaps, I mean, I don't know, from my point of view, the most prestigious Ukrainian newspaper in the US, and was published by the Ukrainian National Association. And writing this, I thought that perhaps the Ukrainian National Association is one of the most interesting organizations in the Ukrainian diaspora in the US, also for the way of supporting and sponsoring various initiatives like press or like universities, university centers of Ukrainian studies and so on. The Ukrainian Canadian newspapers were founded slightly later. After the publication of the first newspaper, the following development of the periodical press in Canada and the United States was often due to the need to give voice to different confessional affiliations of the Ukrainian immigrants. The classic case, it's precisely that of Canada, where Zakhidny Visti and later became Ukrainsky Visti and Novi Shlях were created to give voice to the position close to the Catholic Church, as opposed to the organ closer to the Orthodox Church, which was instead Ukrainsky Holos. The development of the periodical press was also influenced by particular personalities, as in the case of Petro Doroshenko, who, when he arrived in Canada, complained about the backwardness of the Ukrainian Canadian press and spurred his compatriots to catch up with the Ukrainian American newspapers. Or also it was due to the influence of certain events, even traumatic ones, such as the Holodomor. For example, the news of the Holodomor prompted the imagination and then the actual publication of the Ukrainian Weekly, which was born in 1933 at the beginning as a supplement of Svoboda. Ukrainian publication were also affected by the general climate experience in the newly settled states and in the states of new settlement of Ukrainians, and the climate, and also influenced by the climate of international politics. A striking case in point is certainly the journal, the Ukrainian Quarterly, published by the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America since 1944, which was and is a journal dedicated to the sphere of international relations, established towards the end of World War II, when specific communities like the Ukrainians were already seeing a future of global international opposition looming. I must specify that I left out of my analysis scholarly publications devoted to Ukrainian studies. Scholarly or academic publications have a different rationale due to their specific scope that we don't have the time to cover here, and somebody else is going to talk more about the Institutes of Ukrainian Studies and their publications. But I think that the Ukrainian Quarterly is borderline, and being published by the UCCA can be considered a non-academic initiative. Finally, Ukrainian publication abroad often reproduce specific divisions of certain new settlements, as in the Australian case, for example, which is the traditional rivalry between two cities, Melbourne and Sydney, reflected in its newspapers. So you have Ukrainiec в Australia and Життя і Церква for Melbourne, and Vilna Dumka, and they're publishing against Vilna Dumka, that was a newspaper published in Sydney. Finally, for the sake of completeness, I feel that I have to specify that almost every single association or group however small, even just a handful of students in a single university, to the point like 5 students in a single university, used to publish at least one short paper or newsletter. And therefore, clearly, I cannot even mention all the publications, even if they are important, like, for example, Student, which was a very important publication. But what I would like to do with this, I think, very boring introduction now was to stress that what matters at this point is that we need to understand that this eagerness to publish, to create a periodical press linked to the Ukrainian emigration is not accidental and must be explained. So, as you may all know, Benedict Anderson, who defined nations as imagined communities, being also a media scholar, emphasized the importance of the press in building public opinion and thus in building a national community. And the role of the diaspora press is exactly that, or was exactly that, to build a space for dialogue, for confrontation on a global and transnational level. I will explain why on a global and transnational level in a few moments. And how was it possible to do that when the press of the Ukrainian diaspora, as I just said, was so diverse and geographically fragmented? Well, today, of course, it's simpler. You post an article on the internet, anyone from all over the world can read it. If it is an important and newsworthy article, everybody can read it throughout the diaspora, and basically it's done. But how did it work in those times where you don't have this kind of, you have so many different publications? Well, it was possible even back then. For example, it was quite common in the Ukrainian press for an article published in one country and that had sparked an important debate on a certain topic to be republished in other journals in other countries. These debates were summarized in some specific articles. So an article published in the United States, and the debate was summarized on a Ukrainian, Australian newspaper. These debates were reported in other journals, and they in turn sparked a debate after being republished. So there was a sort of debate going on from journal to journal, from newspaper to newspapers. And very often articles that talked about what relationship should be kept with the Soviet Ukraine, or how to keep national identity alive in the diaspora, created such a transnational debate. Then there were events or issues that affected the entire global diaspora because they served as a yardstick by which to address a problem and decide on a strategy. The clearest case being the founding and management of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, for example. The arrival of Ukrainian studies in the academy was a key issue for every Ukrainian national community in any country. And so the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and its affairs were in fact a point of reference discussed by the entire press for many years, many decades, I would say. Another indication that the press was contributing to this sense of diaspora community is provided by the humoristic magazine List Mikita, which was run by Edward Kozak, Luboslav Husalyuk, and Bogdan Nizakivsky, among others. And besides the fact that this magazine is itself somewhat transnational as well, because it originated in Germany, but then moved to the US and had a target audience that was clearly that of the entire diaspora and not only of the US community. Well, very often the cartoons dealt precisely with the problems of creating a community and also finding money for the various initiatives. Here I show this cover from October 1973, celebrating the World Congress of Free Ukrainians in Toronto. And the reason I like it very much is that it represents the elasticity of national affiliation, of national belongings, and the transnational character of the Ukrainian diaspora. We have an Australian kangaroo, the Argentine gaucho, Bavarian in traditional costume, Canadian bagpiper, an American cowboy, an English policeman, and they are all different. But at the same time, they are also all Ukrainians. So the ability to have A common national identity, but also a specific new national identity is what constituted being a diaspora, at least in my opinion. As we can see by this from this drawing, the Ukrainians had a fairly conscious perception of it. In this context, a very special place was occupied by Suchasnist, a magazine that was read by the entire Ukrainian diaspora and was at the center of the cultural and political elaboration of this transnational community. The magazine itself was transnational, born in the climate of cultural ferment of the DP's camps in Germany, the so-called movement, MUR, the artistic Ukrainian movement, and the magazine Arka was also published in Germany. Suchasnist was born in January 1961 as an evolution of the Suchasna Ukraina, the supplement of the Ukrainska Literaturna Gazeta. The main promoter was, or one of the main promoters was Ivan Koshelivets, perhaps you know, a pseudonym for Yareshko. And over the years, various famous intellectuals entered the editorial board. Some of them are also, I mean, among the speakers of this conference. Suchasnist was a forum very open to different visions, and one can come across the opinions of different political movements of the diaspora on its pages. This is true despite the fact that, of course, the publishing house or houses, because there were many, had close ties with the foreign representative of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, especially in the person of Mykola Lebed, who therefore linked this initiative to the CIA and to the Prologue Publishing House. A curiosity, there are some documents about it, and the CIA actually thought that the journal was incredibly boring and wordy, but nevertheless useless in the useful in the fight against the USSR, and for this reason they believe that it should be financed. Here at the top of this slide, you can see a list of the directors during the time Suchasnist was published in the diaspora, because from 1992 it moved to Ukraine, initially jointly directed by Taras Hunchak and Ivan Zuba. Suchasnist ended its publication in 2013. So what did Suchasnist publish? First of all, in an effort to keep the connection with the motherland alive, Suchasnist published a great deal of material that came from Ukraine: poetry, fiction, other articles on social or political content. Very often these were writings that came out of the Samvidav or were even forbidden in Ukraine. Secondly, Suchasnist published scholarly articles, especially in literature, history, sociology, art, and so on. Then there were some very useful articles, informative articles about what was happening and going on in Soviet Ukraine or in the Soviet Union in general. In this genre, I think that the most famous case is perhaps that of Roman Shporluk, who published for years under the pseudonym of Pavlo Chernov. And he published very useful articles for those who want to reconstruct the social and cultural history of Ukraine in the 1960s and 70s. I used those articles, for example, for my research on the Shizdesyatniki. And finally, on the pages of Suchasnist, you can find articles of politics, political analysis, and other articles that dealt precisely with what the diaspora was, what the diaspora community had to do to achieve Ukrainian independence, how to keep the Ukrainian identity alive, etc., etc. And these articles were often discussed and commented on in other publications and contributed to making Suchasnist the journal par excellence of the Ukrainian diaspora in the West. It would be absolutely impossible to summarize 30 years of debates and cultural activity in 2 minutes, and therefore, to give you a taste of what was published in Suchasnist, I want to read a very short quote that today seems to me full of meaning from an article by Miroslav Prokop. Prokop had been a member of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and was a member of the foreign representative of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council. He wrote extensively on the question of Soviet imperialism, and he did so from a very interesting perspective, linking Soviet imperialism to Western imperialism, and therefore thus also linking the decolonization process to the battle for independence in Ukraine. So in an article about Gorbachev, and I must specify that the authors of Suchasnist were never particularly enthusiastic about Gorbachev and his reforms, he commented on the mentality that guided the reforms project of the USSR and wrote, I will read the translation directly, the main ideology on which this empire rests is historical imperial messianism, the idea of an invisible empire that must be protected at all costs. So perhaps that tells us something about the general political climate in Russia. So Suchasnist and also, the Suchasnist publishing house also published books to collect special materials, and the publishing house that I would like to briefly describe now was also born from a magazine, and this was Smoloskip, so the Torch, let's say Torch. The main figure of this publisher was Osip Zinkevich, a member of the ONM, the organization, the Ukrainian nationalists, mainly, let's say, gathered around the figure of Melnik. So from different faction of the Ukrainian nationalists than Suchasnist. Zinkevich managed to flee Germany from Czechoslovakia after the war. There he was arrested for his political activity, and when he was released, he moved to France, where he coordinated the journal Smoloskip, which in the 1950s had a more purely political character. In the 1960s, the interest aroused by the Shizdesyatniki also brought a change in the interest of this journal, which took to publishing more materials that came from Soviet Ukraine. And to give even greater importance to this publication work, Zinkevich decided to found a publishing house in 1967, which almost immediately sprang up as a transnational enterprise between Paris and Baltimore, with representatives also in Canada and Argentina. Between 1967 and 1991, Smoloskip published 68 volumes in Ukrainian and 26 in English, disseminating writing that were prohibited in the Soviet Ukraine. Smoloskip published books on poetry and fiction, volumes on the violations or on the defense of human rights in Ukraine, and some other banned book, such as the books by Khviliovy or the Danilo Shumok's memoirs, which created heated debate in the diaspora. Zinkevich personally and Smoloskip tried to keep an open channel of contact and communication with Soviet Ukraine, in the belief that was actually shared by the good part of the interventions published also on Suchasnist, that Soviet Ukraine was a reality with which the diaspora had to deal, and that it was not possible to live as if Soviet Ukraine did not existed, and then to consider the Soviet period just as an unpleasant parenthesis that could quickly be considered other than the nation and therefore ignored. Something that, for example, perhaps many Italian intellectuals did with fascism. For these reasons, Smoloskip had an efficient information service on Ukraine, and Zinkevich personally was increasingly involved in the transnational struggle for human rights in the USSR as a member of the foreign representations of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, and as a publisher within international institutions like UNESCO. After the Okay. After the independence of Ukraine, Smoloskip also moved to Ukraine, where it remained an active publishing house with a fairly pronounced transnational character, also demonstrated by some recent publications that are both in English and in Ukrainian, as if to suggest that public both inside and outside Ukraine, inside and outside the diaspora, and so thought for anyone who can read English, just like during the Cold War. So conclusions. Among others, I have interviewed many people in the United States and in Canada, but among others, I think that Anna Procik, that is also present here, described to me her task of going to the post office to pick up Ukrainian magazines and books and taking them home to her father, where the whole family would then read them. And she also admitted to the fact that people often bought these publications out of a sense of duty, knowing that they should serve to keep alive a sphere of cultural activity and debate. So I think that these publications, which have a transnational character and circulation, are one of the ways in which a community scattered across several states was able to build a sense of unity, to express a discussion about what relations to maintain with the motherland, to inform themselves about what was happening to their compatriots abroad or at home, and to build a sense of national belonging. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I suspect that there will be lots of questions on this topic, but the other topic that we have is a flip picture of Professor Biletta's presentation. So mark your notebooks of any specific questions you want to place, to put before the panelists, and we'll just move on to Professor Zhuk's presentation without a preliminary discussion question.
So Mark or I will be presenting. Okay.
This is the man who wrote the book Rock and Roll in Rocket City. If you have not read it, I suggest you do, because it's highly illustrative, specifically of this form of interaction, East and West.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, and this presentation will be part of my two projects. One is already published. It's called KGB Operations Against United States and Canada. And another, it's called Use Your Enemy, how Russian Soviet intelligence use Slavic studies and Western academia. So how all this began? As a former Soviet Americanist and DJ, I tried to write something scandalous, challenging what Muscovites and people from Leningrad published, like Yurchak, about culture consumption, rock music consumption in Soviet Union. I was offended by this Moscow centrism and decided to write my own vision. And in those days, I went to my Moscow supervisor of my dissertation, Nikolai Bolkhovinov, who was very interesting case of Russian nationalists who accepted Ukrainian nationalism and who hated Putin, by the way, in those days. And he introduced me to this guy whose name is Basil Mitryshin. Probably some of you know this name, but Basil told me, if you want to write something about America and Ukraine, including your rock and roll, try with Ukrainian diaspora first, and you will see how KGB mistreated and experimented with Ukrainian diaspora using their own models of behavior strategy. So I went to KGB archive, SBU archive in Kyiv, And officers told me that I'm not welcome because I was American professor in those days. So I hated them, you know. But after the first war of Russia against my Ukraine in 2015, all these documents were opened, and I went there. It was 2018, and beginning before COVID phase of 2020, I found treasure of material in fund number 16. It's correspondence of KGB with party leadership, fund number 1 about counterintelligence operation, other funds as well. And the first file, as you see, about American Spy Center, Astra, gave me this very interesting trend in KGB or Soviet and Russian intelligence towards Ukraine. In this file devoted to these beautiful, handsome gentlemen, former Ukrainian DPs, who became agents, first graduates of this spy school, Astra, in Regensburg, Bavaria, and then agents of CIA. Well, what is interesting about these gentlemen in analysis of KGB officers and agents, that they formulated actually major strategy, which is old as ancient Rome, divida et impera, divide and rule, and use your enemy for your own purposes. In this spy center where Ukraine prevailed, they have also Russians, representatives, so-called ROA, Российская освободительная армия, власовцы. And what KGB tried to do, they, from the early beginning, and analysts emphasize this, they tried to use Russians against Ukrainians. And first time in these documents about the Astra spy school, KGB analysts use the word Ukrainian diaspora, Ukrainian immigrants. And from this time on, this emphasis on Ukrainian immigration to America, to Europe, and divisions among diaspora to moderate Melnikovцы and radical Banderivцы was major trope in all these documents. And what happened next, using Russian imperialistic chauvinism, its phrase coined not by my imagination, but these guys by KGB analysts, Russian imperialism. It was used in document, again, this document of 1954. So they used this Russian chauvinism of graduates of this spy school against Ukrainians. And eventually all these Ukrainians were arrested and either they became double agents or were killed by Soviet intelligence. So from the early beginning, Soviet intelligence tried to figure out major enemies. Of course, major enemy was always capitalist America. But for Ukrainian officers of Soviet KGB, it was also Ukrainian diaspora, Ukrainian nationals, which was very dangerous. And as you see, according to archival materials, 90% of all criminal cases were devoted to Ukrainian diaspora in those documents which I investigate. Moreover, as a result, as you see, KGB analysts try to emphasize major theme of all their strategy: compromise, create compromise against your enemies, divide, and weaken from inside. And what is more dangerous for me when I began reading this, first I found some familiar names, for example, Shlipakov, Lещенко, people whom I contacted as young Americanists in Kyiv, who were engaged and served in this service of KGB. But also I realized that results of all these operations still exist. Look at this. Only in 1775-76, KGB organized 4 operations against Ukrainian centers and implanted 28 agents in various centers of the Ukrainian diaspora abroad, including 4 in the United States and 7 in Canada. Probably many of you heard about sleeping cells, and later on I will tell you about how these sleeping cells existed in Canada and the United States, and how many of these sleeping cells from Canada moved to the United States. Previous panel mentioned this immigration of Ukrainian-speaking people from Canada to United States, and forgot that some of these migrations were part of KGB operations. Again, using left from Canada. We forgot that Ukrainian diaspora was not just patriots, members of UNUPA, and so on. 50% of entire Ukrainian diaspora in Canada are left, the left, political left, communists, or sympathize communists. Like Peter Kravchuk, I know his daughter, Larissa, and she helped me with documents from his collection. I was shocked with letters of Alexa Voyna, who was officer of KGB and a representative of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Shlipakov, Lещенko, I can continue on and on. All these guys still, many of them, still active in Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, in Institute of History of Ukraine. And Kravchuk was one of many of people who are used, including another interesting story. Probably people from Canada know this name, Ivan Kalaska, or John Kalaski, who was a student of higher party school in Kyiv, but who found so drastic, so brutal cases of Russification and authoritarian regime in Kyiv and Lviv, everywhere, that he complained, and he eventually published a book, The Shattered Illusion, about how he, being devoted communist, eventually became anti-communist because he found what's going on in Shellist Ukraine. Many of us used to this idealization of Shellist, forgetting that Shellist was one of those who killed, actually, many of these patriotic movements, who was against rock and roll music, by the way, hippie movement and so on. And Kalaski was one of the first in Ukraine diaspora in America who criticized Shellist regime and communists of Soviet Ukraine. Eventually, actually, Peter Kravchuk, I know this from Larissa and from his publication, from documents which I found in archival collection of KGB, took anti-KGB position, criticizing representatives of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like Shevel, and he hated Shevel because Shevel was a man connected to KGB. And we forgot that many of these families, like Shevel family and other families which collaborated with Kravchuk, still have their position in the West, teaching Ukrainian studies, and Kravchuk would be surprised and shocked with this fact, because he was one of the first Canadian communists who eventually rejected this connection to KGB, and he was one of the first who regretted for these connections, because these connections brought him money, Globe Tours and Taras Shevchenko from there were funded partly from the Soviet Union by these guys, and found actually files of KGB documents discussing how much money we need to pay Kravchuk and Globe Tours, when and through what channels and so on. But Kolyasky Kravchuk case, it's very interesting reminder that nothing new today in ideological struggle. And when some Canadian and American sociologists or historians or political scientists try to defend Putin and defend Putin war in Ukraine by struggle against imperialism, we forgot that roots of this came from traditional socialist communist trend in Canada and the United States, which still exists, by the way. Another very interesting thing, and again, probably we will listen to another presentation about Shevchenko monument. Two monuments, one monument in Soviet Union, another monument in the United States, DC. But I try to describe another operation of KGB, which involved the Black Panthers. Probably some of you of older generation remember 1966-68 when KGB supported this Afro-American radical movement in United States. And what KGB tried to do, they remember Divide et Impera, they tried to use Black Panthers and Afro-American radicals, especially from Harvard University in DC, from Ukrainian community in America, presenting Ukrainian community as fascists, racists. And despite the fact that Ukrainian community try to address this issue and show how former slave of Russian landlords, Ukrainian poet and artist, one of the great geniuses of Ukrainian Renaissance, literary Renaissance, Taras Shevchenko, was friendly with Ira Aldrich, with Black American. Despite all this propaganda, still KGB agents prevailed. During the September of 1984, when Ukrainian diaspora tried to organize anti-Soviet manifestations near this monument, they organized Black Panthers attacks. Ukrainians were physically beaten by Afro-Americans, police interfered, and we have a lot of material about this in American press during September of 1984. It was actually a successful operation, KGB operation. They tried to discredit Ukrainian diaspora as fascists and white racists. The same happened in politics. It's another, among many cases, I just give you two, the most successful cases of KGB support of pro-Soviet Ukrainians. This is a case of Canadian businessman of Mark Smirchansky, who took a positive pro-Soviet Ukraine position, and he was supported by KGB representatives through communist press. By the way, every month after September 1966, both Soviet embassy in DC and Ottawa collected all these Ukrainian communists from Canada and United States and told them how to behave and whom to support. For example, they mentioned that this guy should be criticized. Probably many of you who are Canadian descent remember this figure. It's former Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who was very anti-Soviet, and KGB organized campaign of discreditation of this guy, again, using Kravchuk and other communists from Canada as well. And again, we mentioned creation of Ukrainian studies centers. It was another important problem for KGB. From the early beginning, they tried to discredit this guy, Emelian Pritsak, presenting him as collaborator with Nazis, and it was very typical and very stupid position when they try to present all these founders as fascists, because many of them had no relations to these to the spirit of Nazi occupation. But still, not KGB tried to use these figures to discredit Ukrainian national and Ukrainian diaspora. I just put you some figures from documents, and you see that from '69, at least we know that KGB tried to implant to send their representatives or create their supporters in Canadian and Ukrainian and American academia, using the most important centers of Russian and Ukrainian studies. During the 1970s, at least 250 and 30 agents were sent to infiltrate and create sleeping cells there for future intelligence work for KGB and GRU. And what is more dangerous, well, in these documents, these KGB tried to remove names, but I realized that documents were checked in the 90s. These sleeping cells in the University of Toronto and Princeton and Harvard and Stanford still exist. It means that people who taught Russian, Ukrainian studies, Soviet studies, sociology of Soviet Union were in direct contact with KGB in those days. And of course, later on in the 80s, KGB, late 70s and 80s, KGB changed their position. They tried to support more so-called moderate scholars of Ukrainian descent who were at the center of these Ukrainian studies, like Pritsak and Bogdan Kravchenko. And they tried to promote their publications. I found special orders to Nauka in Kyiv to help with their publications in Poland and in Ukraine, vis-a-vis of criticism of those Banderivtsi who took very so-called fascist anti-Soviet position. And again, this is official definition why Soviet Union should support Pritsak and Kravchenko. This is from document sent to political leadership of Kyiv, because these guys rejected participate in the political actions of Banderivtsi, oppose their attitudes directed on boycott of the scientific and cultural connection with Soviet Ukraine. In contrast to Banderivtsi, I quote, Pritsak and Kravchenko demanded directing the activities of the Ukrainian immigration to a preservation of the Ukrainian language, culture, and strengthening its cultural role in the social life of the country of their residents. And another location of operation. How many of you know about American exhibits in Kyiv and in Soviet Ukraine? Raise your hands. They had hilarious facility. I actually visited some of them. They started from '61, and do you know what KGB did? They actually targeted these exhibits, and the more major important target was, of course, people of Ukrainian descent, those who spoke Ukrainian. I found many files about these people. Again, KGB returned to traditional tactics: divide and rule, use your enemies. They use people of Russian origin who Americans of Russian origin who were hired for these conferences, for these exhibitions, to use them against Ukrainians. So it's another traditional strategy. And of course, if you go to KGB archive, you will find many documents about those scholars of Ukrainian descent who use opportunities of academic exchange, who went to Kiev or who were forbidden to go to Kiev, like Sissin. Sissin was interpreted in this document, Frank Sissin, as the worst enemy of Soviet Ukraine. Himka was presented as CIA agent. And it's the largest file I ever seen. I told John that you probably work for both of these agents. I mean, CIA and the KGB. There's too many documents. It's a joke again. But again, we have the same trend, attacking and targeting people of Ukrainian descent. And this is another proof of the CIA connections. People in exchange of Ukrainian descent, Mogilnitsky, I forgot his first name, who was a music major in Kiev, was arrested for spreading lies about Holodomor, about this tragedy. And again, Holodomor was, of course, forbidden topic for this, and he was arrested and sent back to United States. So I can continue on and on. I just wanted to mention the major trend.
Yes.
I can finish.
Yes.
And the results. What were the results? The same. To use Russian-sponsored people of Russian descent or connected to Russian intelligence, to Russian money, and promote these anti-Ukrainian images. I'll just show you some institutions which were targeted by Russian intelligence after collapse of the Soviet Union. Cannon Institute, especially after the ruble left with Rozhansky. Carnegie Endowment, Monterey Initiative of Russian Standards, London School of Economics. They replace Applebaum with Zubok for Russian scholar. Kalman Institute of Russian, and I will show you these. Ruski Mir Foundation, it's KGB and GRU sponsored organization, which led by my former colleague, Americanist Vyacheslav Nikonov. Look at this. Matthew Rozhansky was the most important representative. Andrei Tsigankov, who is professor of the University of San Francisco. Vyacheslav Zubok, London School of Economics. Valdai Discussion Club created by KGB and KGB led. And again, Matthew Rozhansky, Andrei Tsigankov, and I continue on and on. Americanists who became so-called проректор по работе с американцами, с иностранцами, it's KGB or FSB nomenclature. They began guests of our conference, Slavic Association. I just showed these pictures of those guys who had direct or indirect connection to Russian intelligence, who either openly criticize Ukraine or keep silence, especially during this war in Ukraine. So the last scandal is Anton Fedyash, American University. You see his students who was FSB agent, who took very anti-Ukrainian position, and he still teaches it. Yeah. So remember this, and you see who support him. This crazy lady, Susan Carmel Lemon, who gave millions of dollars, who hate Ukraine openly, who met Kislyak, probably general of FSB, and you see pictures from American University. So this is another reminder that we're still dealing with real threat, which coming from Russian Federation, through Russian money, through Russian corruption. Look how much money invested in this country. It's not just Cannon Institute not Carnegie Foundation. It's other institutions, including Princeton, Harvard, and plus businesses, finances. And because Western politicians are so poor, they love Russian cash. Thank you very much.
Thank
But remember about this danger.
You see how complex the situation was. And even our attempts to present the various aspects that interacted at the time when we were trying to establish Ukrainian studies, how difficult it was to tell right from wrong, and how impossible it was to be 100% certain of this position or that position. Sometimes in retrospect, we tend to present a more coherent picture, and also a picture in which the diaspora is presented as united in its intellectual pursuits. But on the contrary, there were few people who read Suchasnost. There were few people who participated in any type of interaction with the Soviet Union. That's something that we have to keep in mind. And now we turn to literally turn to Markian Dobzhansky. And I, Markian, must confess that I do not know your subject. So please introduce the subject too.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Barczewski-Chomyak and colleagues on the panel. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I'd like to also basically thank the organizers for the invitation, and also continuing to work on this project in spite of numerous and repeated setbacks occasioned by the difficulties presented by our modern world. Earlier this fall, I thought that my participation in this conference could only happen online because of commitments that I had in a new job at the University of Illinois. And in the end, it's a good thing that I made that decision, because last week I got COVID and I'm still testing positive. So needless to say, any of the travel plans that I would have made to attend the conference would have become impossible. And that explains my voice. I'm really on the tail end here, but I'm still testing positive. So all of that being said, I'm very glad to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. So the topic of my paper and proposal and presentation is towards a history of the Ukrainian Cold War. And this paper is an introductory proposal for a project that is still in its early stages. So I'll try to attempt to sketch out the how of writing a synthetic history of the Ukrainian Cold War while paying attention to its difficulties and challenges. So I'll structure it in a couple of ways. So I'll start out with definitions. So what is the Ukrainian Cold War? Talk about the major timelines that we're dealing with and the periodization. I'll talk a little bit about the historiographical sort of directions and talk about the metaphors that I use to think through the kind of historiographical contribution a project like this would make. And then I'll also talk about the specific contributions both to Soviet history and to Ukrainian history, because thinking about the Cold War synthetically necessarily implicates both of those fields. So Soviet history and Ukrainian history. It's to some extent the history of the Cold War is its own field, but I'm not really quite sure where a project like this would fit into that historiography, which is so focused on states and international relations. So what is the Ukrainian Cold War? And I would say that this basically is a period of Ukrainian political history that it's both shaped by and shapes the conduct of the Cold War, which is an ideological conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. For the most part, the Ukrainian aspect of this takes place largely in the political realm, and it largely plays out in public through community events, through attempting to influence the policies of the United States and Canada, and also through the attempt, through the Soviet Ukrainian efforts to respond and influence events that are going on in North America, which is to some extent, already discussed quite wonderfully and interestingly and provocatively by Professor Zhuk. But I think rather than looking at strictly like KGB initiatives, I think that a political history should take into account more than that. Obviously, the KGB was very important to that, but it also should take into account Soviet Ukrainian cultural initiatives that were meant to compete for hearts and minds to some extent. So what is distinctive about this period in the history of Ukraine? And so definitionally, I think we need to start with the Soviet Ukrainian state as it existed. All right. So I would put the periodization basically from 1945 to 1989. There are certainly antecedents to that period in Ukrainian history where Ukrainian emigres and the Soviet Ukrainian state competed in various ways, but I would need to draw a boundary here about 1945, because that is the point at which the global Cold War, the bipolar sort of world order, begins to structure this Ukrainian political competition. Almost all of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory was integrated into the Soviet Union within a Ukrainian republic. That had basically been the case from 1939, with a small addition of Transcarpathia in 1945. But basically, Ukraine as it was imagined and as it exists today, basically was all part of a single state. And that was a unique, novel, or not unique, but a novel situation in Ukrainian history. So there was no more division between empires. There was no more 1930s era Eastern European division among nationalizing states. There was strictly speaking a kind of Soviet Ukrainian republic in a single territorial configuration. There were certain exceptions to this. Regions outside of Soviet Ukraine included the Kuban, which was part of the Russian Federative Soviet Republic, Eastern Poland, Eastern Czechoslovakia, in which the Ukrainian population was either ethnically cleansed, as it was in Poland, or successfully depoliticized, as it was in Kuban and in Eastern Poland. And that circumstance is also a bit of a historical novelty, because those places had movements in that made Ukrainian-centric claims, right? In the Kuban, you had Cossack movements, and Ukrainian language schools had been set up in the late 1920s. But after that, this issue became a non-starter. So that's the first sort of way I would define it. Almost all Ukrainian territory was within a Soviet Ukrainian republic. Also, the second sort of like historical novelty is that the centers of Ukrainian émigré activism shifted much farther to the West than ever before, largely the US, Canada, Australia, and they also shifted farther away from Ukraine than ever before. So it was made it more difficult to keep track of events in Ukraine on a kind of more geographically closely aligned level. And that differentiates it also from the 1930s, when the major centers of Ukrainian emigration were in Prague or in Central Europe. The big kind of distribution of forces within this superpower competition was, on the one side, a superpower with a federal entity within that federal structure. Soviet Ukraine was a state. Soviet Ukraine had a bureaucracy. Soviet Ukraine had a foreign ministry. It had some role to play within carrying out the broader Soviet political agenda. And that's on one side. And on the other side, you have diaspora communities, emigre political parties, churches, scholarly societies, and other kinds of community organizations that largely didn't have state power, right? They had a lot of claims. They had a lot of ways that they were used to thinking about themselves. Certainly the political parties had some experience in trying to build states, but this was really a very, very far distant prospect. So these communities obviously were trying to find a new home for themselves in North America, and they changed greatly. So that's the sort of structural balance of forces, right, which is in many ways an unequal struggle, but in a lot of ways, the emigre Ukrainians' access to the freedom of organization, access to media, access to fora in which they could express their political claims, such as at the UN or in front of Soviet embassies. This access allowed diaspora communities to punch above their weight to a certain extent, and become troublesome for an international superpower. And so what would be a kind of periodization in telling the history of this war? It is sort of, I mean, the way that I think about it now is it kind of lines up with the general Cold War kind of a timeline, but I want to be attentive to things that don't necessarily line up with that as well. And that's one of the challenges. So in general, I would say that the early post-war years, as Professor Zhuk indicates, right, that includes a surprising amount of hard power and espionage, sort of methods. In the 1950s and 1960s, I would say that the action shifts more towards cultural competition and arguments over Russification. And this, to some extent, parallels the rise of the Shishtisyatniki and dissidents, as Dr. Beletsa discusses in his work on this topic. But it also predates that to a certain extent in initiatives and major kind of international competitions, such as the marking the Shevchenko anniversary, the 150th anniversary of Shevchenko's birth in the 1960s. And that is really a kind of major high point in attention that gets paid to these Ukrainian issues. It parallels in many ways American and Soviet history, because on the American side, the mobilization of ethnic communities, specifically white ethnic communities, was a kind of a model for American Cold War politics in the 1950s with President Eisenhower and the Captive Nations initiatives. Ukrainians were a prominent voice among many communities in defining cultural claims at that time. And then on the Soviet side, it also coincided with a period in which the Ukrainian party played a more significant role in overall Soviet politics. This was the period of the late Khrushchev era and the first secretaryships of Nikolai Podgorny, better known in Ukrainian as Mykola, or lesser known in Ukrainian as Mykola Podgorny, and Petro Shelest. So that's a period in which Ukrainian party officials had a lot more latitude in promoting and mobilizing Ukrainian topics to sort of promote themselves and the republic. This really does change quite a bit after 1965, after the rise of the Shizdesyatniki and the Brezhnev era. The competition, I would say, shifts more towards human rights and the issues that the dissidents and Shizdesyatniki raised, and then their repression. And do you see that the sort of shift on the American side here moves more towards activism and considering these issues, rather than talking about the Cold War as such? There's a moment in the 1970s when a discourse moves decisively towards human rights and the defense of human rights, and the Ukrainian issue fits in very well with this kind of activism. Basically, Ukrainian dissidents become spokesmen for a kind of broader issue of Ukrainian human rights. National rights fit into this discourse pretty well. Finally, the 1980s, the arguments begin to shift towards history, the legacy of Stalinism, and the legitimacy of the Soviet system as a whole. And here, the 50th anniversary of the famine becomes an extremely topical issue of concern, both within the diaspora communities, which seize on this anniversary as an opportunity to mobilize themselves, and also within the Soviet Union, where topics about the evils of Stalinism begin to percolate under the surface and really explode into public view in the late 1980s. And then globally, this moment of the late 1980s also begins to influence the state of play of the Ukrainian Cold War, because it's a moment in which the global structures of politics begin to change quite dramatically. The communism, the leading communist country in the world collapses. Communism begins to be discredited, and we begin to move towards a kind of new world without a bifurcated structure of politics. Just a quick word about sources. So the thing that would need to be done here is paying a specific attention to Soviet Ukrainian archives, especially KGB, but also Ukrainian and to some extent Russian archives. I have done some research in Moscow, found a few discussions of Ukrainian emigre issues at the Russian State Archive of Contemporary History. But again, access to those archives will be quite limited going forward. But also the Ukrainian Central Committee and then the state structures that are dedicated to engaging diaspora communities abroad, as well as the foreign ministry. So you'll find a lot of discussions of these things, a lot of monitoring, a lot of analysis, and some description, as Dr. Zhuk notes, of course, of active measures, right, by the KGB. Then also the other thing that always has to supplement these archival forays, right, is memoirs and interviews with participants to the greatest extent possible. So a surprising number of Soviet bureaucrats have left behind memoirs where they discuss these issues, and often the things that they do mention tend to be political, or they tend to be something that is a kind of an issue that pops up into their awareness that they feel they need to deal with, right? There's a lot of responsibilities that Soviet elites have for managing the affairs of the Ukrainian Republic, but some of them are not worth mentioning or discussing. So the memoirs of Vitaly Ovcharenko or Petroshelist are indispensable. If we had a memoir from Andriy Skaba, that would be amazing, because he was like a really central figure in all this. But you have to take what you can get, and you're sort of limited by the perspectives that they have. And then finally, diaspora activists have also left behind their memoirs. I know Dr. Zhuk has already discussed Kolaski and Peter Kravchuk. These memoirs can offer a sort of personal glimpse to the extent that it's possible to do so. So two difficulties of the topic. So there's an incredible diversity of actors and institutions across Canada and the US, and they change rapidly. That's on the one hand, right? In these emigre communities, it really depends on what topic you're interested in, and that will sort of reveal which actors were most active in engaging on these issues. And on the other side, I would say that there's more stasis and continuity than dramatic changes, especially by the 70s and the 80s. Once outreach to the Ukrainian diaspora communities becomes less plausible, less successful, and becomes more about disruption rather than providing a positive image of Soviet Ukraine, which had been the strategy to a great extent in the 50s and 60s. Coinciding, of course, with disruption, but there's just I think that Soviet Ukrainian soft power just really wanes in its ability to mobilize people by the 70s and 80s. There's also a difficulty of keeping an eye on changes in the dynamics of the Soviet diasporic interaction and disentangling them from the general outlines of the Cold War, which I've touched on before. And so the proposal here is generally that this should be a book like this, or a project like this, a history of the Ukrainian Cold War, should be a political history of diaspora-Soviet interaction, which is focused on the diaspora community's mobilization and the attempts to disrupt and influence those communities on the part of the Soviet Union. And here again, I would echo the scholars from the previous panel who said that moments of crisis tend to put the diaspora into high gear and tend to get the most attention. All right, and that's true both in the West, but especially within the Soviet elite, where suddenly something like the famine or the founding of Huri begin to get the attention of, or the statue, the Shevchenko statue in 1959 and 60, right? Those initiatives, those begin to get the attention of the Soviet elite, and you start to be able to track them in the archival records. So I'd like to think about a couple of metaphors for what this project would actually do to the historiography. So one would be integration and one would be disaggregation. So I think that a synthetic narrative of the Ukrainian Cold War has to integrate the transnational history of this, which includes Ukrainians on all sides of the conflict, and really show how they engaged and interacted with one another. This is including Ukrainian Americans, Ukrainian Canadians, as well as Soviet Ukrainian political and cultural elites that are engaged with the diaspora. And this is really a crucial intellectual contribution here, because it has a potential to show how Ukrainian issues were not hermetically sealed off from one another. And these kinds of networks of interaction and competition and contestation transcended the traditional Cold War boundaries. We're learning more and more about that with a lot of the scholarship. But I think that crucial interpretive point shouldn't be lost. And then as far as disaggregating, I think that one of the things that this project can really highlight is disaggregating Soviet foreign policy. If you look away from Moscow and you look at the non-Russian republics, you'll notice that those republics had specific kinds of ways or modalities of carrying out Soviet foreign policy, and often they had very specific goals. So if you look at Uzbekistan in the Cold War, a lot of times Uzbekistan was held up as a showcase for the third world, as Paul Stronsky demonstrates in his book about Tashkent. Uzbekistan was kind of presented as an underdeveloped backwater that Soviet policies had brought to fruition, right? So, and if you look at Armenia, Armenia also in the 60s and 70s had its own sort of national or cultural agenda, right? The beginnings of the Soviet commemorations of the Armenian genocide begin to play out there, and the Soviet Armenian state builds a memorial, and in this way sort of plays its own role in Soviet foreign policy, either reaching out to Armenian communities around the world to try to show that, yes, the Soviet Union also cares about your national tragedy, etc. If you look at the Baltics, right, then it all becomes about Europe and about kind of legitimizing Soviet claims to the Baltic states, right? The Soviets were highly vulnerable in the Baltics within the context of the Cold War because the United States never recognized the annexation of those countries, right? So where does Ukraine fit into this? Well, I think that Ukraine also is playing its part in sort of ethnicized Soviet foreign policy because Soviet Ukraine is strategically so crucial. It plays this role of reaching out to diasporic communities and also to some extent neutralizing the appeal of Ukrainian anti-imperial discourse in the West as a sort of marker of Canadian or US foreign policy, right? So it's trying to limit the influence of that. And in that case, in that sense, right, Soviet Ukraine has to present itself as a friend to Ukrainian culture. Just two more points kind of on the contribution to Soviet history. So this history fundamentally has to do with the Soviet Union and the Soviet Ukrainian Republic, and which is not always the same as a Ukrainian homeland, but in many ways it overlaps. So the field has to engage. So this work would have to engage with the broader field of scholars studying the Soviet Union. And I want to sort of gently remind people that this is something that has to speak to Soviet historians in order to be influential within the academy. And
unfortunately, I have to gently remind you that your time is elapsed.
Okay, great. I just have two more minutes then. So research of this sort should tell us new things about the intersection of Soviet nationalities policy and Soviet foreign policy. And my argument and the general interpretive thrust of a lot of the work in this is to remind us that Soviet foreign policy was deeply ethnicized, just as we have been spending the last 30 years remembering that the Soviet Union promoted nationalities policy domestically. It also had a national coloring in foreign policy. And this sort of can foreground the issue of empire in Soviet foreign policy and in the Cold War. And then finally, the contribution to Ukrainian history, right? So we sort of end where we began, talking about the Soviet Ukrainian state. And the Cold War, the Ukrainian Cold War coincided with the post-1945 USSR, and the land itself is united, but at the same time, the people were deeply divided, right? With the most anti-Soviet parts of the population forced into exile or severely repressed within the Soviet Union. And so traditional political cleavages were taken with people into the emigration and transferred into new contexts. And so a lot of the what we would otherwise have expected as normal democratic political contestation played out in a transnational diasporic space rather than within the representative institutions of a single state. So where does the Soviet Ukrainian state fit into the broader narrative of Ukrainian history? And by the way, both of those things are Soviet products, the unification of the land and also the deep divisions of the population. So where is the Soviet Ukrainian state? I'd say that it's a specific stage, and it focused politics around the issue of national subjugation and the liberation of a state, rather than other kinds of issues, right? Like social issues or I don't know, economic issues, right? This is a political competition that's focused on the existence and the character of a specific state, and what the conditions must be for its liberation. So I'll just stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, I'm trying to see how the three panelists can interact and return to the basic topic of this conference, and that is the establishment of the diaspora studies. And I would probably object to the formulation of using Cold War within the context of Ukraine and Ukrainian history. It would presume that Ukraine was an independent entity and that the Ukrainian diaspora was dealing primarily in politics. And although the diaspora has often been accused of dealing exclusively in political verbiage, the achievements of the diaspora cannot be limited to a simply political stance. And that is why I objected to the use of the term Ukrainian studies during the Cold War, because that is actually not quite true. As both of the previous panelists have demonstrated, there were a myriad of other issues. So I have been quite clear on the time, at least, and I am certain that there will be a plethora of questions. Anya?
Excuse me.
Well, then maybe,
Sorry.
Simon Beleza. I'd like to thank Simon Beleza for quoting me, but the quotation must belong to someone else. Because at the time that I worked closely with Zienkiewicz, I had absolutely no time to be in contact with my father. I had a family to raise, and I was getting my PhD at Columbia. And I was working with Zienkiewicz, and that meant a telephone call almost every day. It was he who involved me with Amnesty International at a time when I thought impossible, but somehow under his influence, under his pressure, I found the time. And I'm very happy that I did get involved because very good things came out of my work with Amnesty. It was not just my studies. It was not just my family, but something that was important, especially in those days. Here, I also would like to point out that I was not the only one who was recruited by Zienkiewicz. There was a group of young women in Baltimore that were helping him as well. And Christina Isayev, who has been very much involved in defense of human rights, is one of them. I suppose I just made a comment. So the quotation must belong to someone else. Since you raised the question of my father, by the way, did not belong to the Melnik group, but he did support Zienkiewicz because Zienkiewicz was doing good work. Also, I'd like to point out that Zienkiewicz had a mentor when he was, that is, beginning with his life in France, the editor of Ukraińskie Słowo, Oleg Sztul-Zdanowicz. And from my point of view, Oleg Sztul-Zdanowicz perhaps was the best analyst of the Soviet reality that I have encountered. And of course, I had as one of my professors, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and that tells you a great deal. So until Sztul-Zdanowicz was alive, Zienkiewicz was doing excellent work. He continued, but it was my impression that his political views somehow changed. Thank you.
I don't know if I have to comment to that very briefly. I have your record, so but perhaps I wasn't completely clear. This quotation is about you telling about your teenagers' years. You were still younger. They have a very long. We had a very long interview, so it's before your active involvement in any kind of movement. You were telling as a girl, as a schoolgirl, sent by your father to take the post. But
Yeah.
Thank you for this fantastic, very, very thought-provoking presentations. I have a general question about first question to Professor about the KGB involvement in Ukrainian diaspora. I assume all this information is from KGB archives that you researched in Ukraine. Thank you. Second question about the studies. Do you think it's a time or Ukrainian diaspora should actually push for changing the programs in US universities and establishing more precise, clear program for Ukrainian studies, not Slavic studies, not Russian studies, not something else, just directly Ukrainian studies. I feel there's need of that. Every time up till now, Ukrainian studies is always under Russian kind of or Slavic oversight. And I would like to hear your thought on that issue. Thank you.
Well, let me answer the second part of your question, of your comment. In the United States, it is impossible to provide a direct instruction to a university how a specific academic program is structured, so that Ukrainian studies, in the sense, never existed as such, but various topics in which Ukraine was covered, sometimes as Ukrainian history, sometimes as Ukrainian literature, depended in large measure in the structure of a particular university and in the structure of a particular discipline. In the United States, when and pardon my use of personal experience, when I came to Columbia as a graduate student, I was warned by the then president of NTSA, Professor Roman Smalstotsky, that his younger colleague is teaching at Columbia, and he is teaching a course on the history of Rus and the rise of the Russian state. And therefore, I will become completely Russified when I come to Columbia University. But as to the establishment of Ukrainian studies, that as a discipline, that depends on a particular university and on the various funding available for that, as much as we have available human resources to teach the courses. So that's the answer to
Yeah,
you.
and just add, it depends also on personality of professor. And unfortunately, in my state, Indiana, Bloomington, where Hiragi Kuramiya was teaching Ukrainian history, they lost actual opportunity to create this. So, frankly speaking, I try to do this in both states. I don't care what people said, because now I have position, I have support of my administration, and it depends on personality. Unfortunately, sometimes our academics too coward. It's true. And especially in Slavic studies. Sorry about this.
Okay. Next question. Can I recognize my daughter?
My question today is, I'm really glad I'm involved with the organization Erasm, and my question is about decolonizing academia. So I'm really glad that you're untangling the information flows between the press through the post-World War II period, and calling out and articulating what was the back and forth with the various KGB operations. So knowing all of this now, instead of reinventing the wheel, what can we be doing now, learning from these lessons to decolonize a sort of Moscow-centric view in academia specifically, since we're here at also my alma mater, Columbia? What should we do?
More topics, anti-Russian and representing other nations of former Russian Empire, emphasizing what we know about our particular field, for example, Ukrainian studies. This only one approach. Yeah, you need to explain that Russia started as empire, and you need to present other nations which will incorporate in this. And this will be beginning of decolonization, because otherwise we'll be continued to doing what in Cold War they taught. Russian studies, Russian history, Russian civilization, and emphasize only Moscow-centered problems. If we decentralize this and using available material, explain role of Ukraine, Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukrainian music, Ukrainian artists like Taras Shevchenko, and so on, it will be my students who are mostly first generation of people who came from farmers' family have very important experience, because before this, their teachers in high school taught only Russian-centered, Moscow-centered, Leningrad-centered stories. So that's why we need to decentralize and emphasize on our roots. And this will be attraction, great attraction, because if we sincere when we talk about our own stuff.
Well, let me interrupt you and say that most of the of the Ukrainian diaspora, each individual, regardless of his or her profession, has been trying to do that with every single non-Ukrainian they have ever met, of trying to educate them into the existence of Ukraine as a separate entity. I'm pointing my finger, my pen.
Can I just mention something on that point?
Mhm.
Okay, so just really quickly, I think that it's not. I mean, it's clearly. Talking about how the Soviet Union was sort of ethnicized and a federation and all that, that's very important. And scholars have been doing that for a long time. But publicly, I think that that's still something that people get confused about, and they don't really know where these Ukrainian or Uzbek or Estonian countries came from, right? So that's still a front that people can still talk about. But I think that the other interesting thing to highlight is really that Russia is different. Russia has basically rejected the Soviet inheritance in this sense. And it doesn't think of a federation with these countries. It thinks of imposing its will and basically destroying all of these other states, which had some sort of quasi-existence for a long time already, including independence for the last 30 years. And I think that really hasn't sunk in any way. People conflate the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, but the Russian Federation is really quite different, and it's really a revanchist power at this point. And that's another way of decolonizing, is to point out just how different the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union were.
We have not gone back into the pre-Soviet time and the attempts, sometimes highly successful, of the Tsarist regime of penetration of the Ukrainian emigration, of the Ukrainian settlers in the United States.
I got the microphone. Sorry.
Who has the mic?
So I'm just going to go. I mean, this is a fascinating discussion, and I feel guilty interrupting it by changing the subject, because it really warrants a full discussion. Two comments and a question, which I hope will be quick. First of all, the KGB was absolutely right. Frank Sisson, if he's listening, you were the most dangerous man and still remain the most dangerous man in the diaspora. Secondly, to Sadhi's talk, there has to be a sharp difference between the pre-1991 era and the post-1991 era. I mean, you were showing us pictures of Emelian Pretsak and John Paul Himka. All of these people were not just targets; they were also actors trying to influence in the other direction as well. And that's a stark contrast to the way that disinformation and infiltration has worked with money after 1991. But my question is, in your research, have you come across anything about John Demjanjuk? I mean, you've talked about the projects targeting the Ukrainian community. To me, that seems like it was possibly their most successful and effective plot.
Yeah, I found, but I did not cover this. First of all, because my colleague Ola Bertelsen began writing this. We discussed this, and I told her that I will not. It's her subject. But in my next book, I will approach this, but for different reason. How Israel academics, how Russian academics, and American academics treat this. So I will take different position than Ola did. She just analyzed the documents and first time publicized them. But I will show how this created a contradiction, academic contradiction, which was exploited by not only by KGB but also post-Soviet Russian intelligence, trying to use Jews against Ukraine. There's tradition, from Soviet time. Yeah. So this is, and the KGB or NKVD used Jews to attack Petlura, to attack other active members of Ukrainian national movement. So it's all tradition. But I avoided this because it's already done by Ola. I just put what I found new.
Thank you. Going back to the earlier question, I think we need to recognize that all universities and colleges, undergrads, have a core curriculum that will then limit your degrees of freedom of introducing any type of shift to decolonization or de-imperialization aspects. And on the graduate level, most universities define the subject areas in which you can get a degree. And Under Pritsak at Harvard, there was no Ukrainian field of history. Under Shpurlyuk at Harvard, there was no field defined for Ukrainian history. It was only Serhiy Plokhy who managed to change that. So, in a way, when you think of innovating at the university level, the first thing we need to do is to get a very solid grasp of how universities function, what degrees of freedom you have, what is negotiable and what is not. And only when you recognize that, then you have both feet on the ground and you know where you're going. The question I have concerning KGB agents is the following. I'm sure you use some type of criteria to define what is a KGB agent, either someone on the payroll, someone who has a pension, or some real criteria other than just being associated. Because KGB archives and those documents require more than one lifetime to figure out how to deconvolute and read. And one interpretation may not be the ultimate one that reflects what reality was. So there's much caution that needs to be added to these types of analysis. And the last question is, in trying to get this analysis going, one of the interesting ways of doing it would be to compare to the materials found in other security archives, like, for example, at IPN in Warsaw, what the Polish services knew about the Ukrainian diaspora, what they were reporting, and how their reports were conveyed to the Soviet Union. Because it's my impression that the KGB in Kiev totally missed the boat on the Harvard project and on Ukrainian scholarship generally. They were more focused on the Mandarin's, on Yaroslav Stichko, for example. That provocation evolved in the early 60s in terms of falsification of documents, and then labeling him as someone who supported the Holocaust. But nevertheless, it is my impression that the Poles got in much faster to the development of Ukrainian studies at Harvard as a threat to the communist ideology, and tipped off Kiev, which then began to dig deeper. So I'm just curious whether you had the chance yet to do this investigation in other services as well. And then the American service also.
Yeah, I began working with CIA documents because there was initially a second book about how CIA treated Ukrainian diaspora, and you were surprised how much restrictions I had to get these documents from National Archives, from FBI, but anyway, I agree with you that I need to work probably with Polish, with Stasi archives, because I found Stasi information about Ukrainians in Germany. And I discussed with Plokhy about Stashinsky case, because I found documents which he dismissed, well, because he published already when this was found, how Stasi informed KGB in Kiev about situation in Germany, including Stashinsky links and connections. I only disagree with one thing. KGB gave us a definition of KGB agent with all perks, with all pensions fund and so on. It's very, very detailed actual documents which are available in Fund 16 for everyone who can read, not Ukrainian, in Russian, by the way, all these documents. So, but still, we need to understand, and this is the most dangerous described for me. Even with all these limits, as I realized, we still have these sleeping cells. And some people, and I encountered some of these guys, I tried to figure who this will from Toronto Sun, from other people. These guys still in editorial boards, they still have property in Canada and the United States. Of course, nobody would accept that he or she related to this background, but it's very dangerous trend. And I'm afraid that Putin will use these guys in future for different purposes.
But Simona also has.
No, well, no, I do not really have a comment. I was just agreeing with what was being said. That I mean, from what I have been reading in the KGB archives, I agree that there was an obsession with Stetsko and the anti-Bolshevik League. I mean, even if they are discussing topics like the Shizdesyatniki or the various cultural organizations in the West, I mean, the obsession is more with this kind of like I would say, more political nationalist Ukrainian activists than not the cultural
An attempt
activities.
to discredit the academic achievements of Ukrainians by reducing them simply to ideological defense of Ukrainian nationalism. And that has been a standard approach that in the United States, that is generally encountered in universities, where topics dealing with Russia or even with the Central Asian republics would have been recognized as genuine fields of interest and study. The validity of a Ukrainian topic, or the importance of a Ukrainian topic, would often be questioned. Part of the problem was our own inability to view the question within a broader context. But as Markian's proposal illustrates, an attempt to view the Ukrainian situation within an accepted framework, like the Cold War, has to be studied from all sides also, to see whether the Cold War actually works for this study, for the analysis of what was going on in Ukraine and among the Ukrainian intellectual elite, as small as it was. Any other quick questions, because you are eating into your own lunch hour?
I will follow in the steps of Ola. I've got a mic. I do have a short question, but I will not start with it, and it's to Professor Beleza. Coming back to the issue raised by Dora and others with respect to decolonizing the Slavic studies and Ukrainian studies, bringing it up onto the proper place. Colonization and colonizing discourse, Russian-centric discourse, has taken centuries to form. We have to realize it will take us a while to undo it. There are ways to approach it. There are academic perspectives. There's university administrations that can be worked on. There's a community perspective, and in this we all are together. I have been presenting on this topic already at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. A few months into the 2023, we will have another academic conference devoted to that. And next week, some of us are at the ACES, where we will start talking again. I've taken all my time, but I do have a short question to Attila. Thank you so much for bringing in focus on literature when it comes down to building Ukrainian identities and working out of diaspora on these very issues. I have a question concerning the moving of Suchasnist and other publication projects back to Ukraine. At some point, you've mentioned that they cease to be diasporic, or I think in your words you used transnational, and you've emphasized the point they've become national. Why they've ceased to be diasporic? Is this the right approach to take, or they continue to be part of the global Ukrainian scene or not?
Okay, I thank you for the question. I'm not sure that I have said that. So did I? Okay, no, no. I mean, on the contrary, I think that Smaller Skip is a project that keeps on being transnational because it keeps on publishing in English as well. And so the idea is to have a public, an audience also outside Ukraine and outside the people that are speaking Ukrainian. Regarding perhaps Suchasness is a little different because, I mean, the first question may be why did the journal stop publications? And the reason perhaps is that that journal turned out to be something different from what it started. And that the focus was much more on Ukraine itself and on Ukrainians, and you also have like a change in the people who are actually writing in the journal, and that's perhaps the case where you can say that that journal from transnational turned into a national journal that had a less transnational audience of readers. Perhaps that's all. If I may say something on this question of the decolonizing of Ukrainian studies and so on and so forth, I mean, I perhaps can offer a different perspective. I'm trying not to be too long about it, but I mean, as being Italian, you know, in Italy, you don't have this kind of area studies at the university. You have only if you are studying foreign languages. So if you are studying if you want to study some Slavic languages, you have to enter an area study that keeps together also German languages, which is pretty particular. No, there's like German, Ukrainian, Swedish, and so on. They are all a group together, and so it's very difficult. I mean, to fight to have a chair in your own language, and but I mean, one way that I see that you can use to decolonize Ukrainian studies when you are teaching to a public that knows nothing about Russian and Ukrainian studies, and perhaps we also have the question of, I mean, teaching people that are not already into these topics, is to use comparison. For example, I use Ukrainian history and Italian history, and I used to compare them, and that works very, very well, because no matter how far different they are, there are some topics that are all the same. And as I also referred to in my presentations, fascism and communism, these are two similar dictatorships or totalitarianism. It depends on, so this is a topic. To what point, and we have a problem with like monument and raising. We have a problem with memory and with people who are involved in the regime that are still in the political life. So, and this is maybe this is something very, I don't know, naive, very stupid, but it's something that you just, I don't know, leave out for a moment the Russian side of it, and you just compare directly Ukraine to another reality. This is a way that you can, and I think that only demonstrating how Ukrainian studies or studying Ukrainian stuff is interesting and matters to what people do in other countries can help in building the idea that you need Ukrainian studies also outside the more traditional areas where these studies are usually cultivated.
Any other questions? Do any of the panelists have concluding remarks?
Just we can compare American War of Independence and Ukraine as well. So I do this in my classes all the time, because my students had no idea about European history, but they know American history.
Why not? You know, yesterday was the Shevchenko Scientific Society. I was looking for the papers of Yevgen Donatsky, who was a Ukrainian nationalist, so he was the founder of Ukrainian studies in Italy, because he lived for a very long time during fascism in Italy. And I was really surprised to find out that actually during the first years after the First World War, there was a journal published in Italy called Ukrainsky Horus, but in Italian, La Voce dell'Ucraina. And the Italian press used to call Pictura the Ukrainian Garibaldi. So yeah, you need to use that to show that there are some links that can be exploited.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the audience, and thank you for letting me talk a bit. It's not the only, but
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's called
I really feel strongly
operations
about
against
using
United States and Canada
national,
in Soviet Ukraine.
about. And who's the